That's a little bit of a downer, eh? We're going to talk about that today. It's great to see you. Welcome to MCC. If this is your first time especially, we're thrilled you're here. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, we're thrilled that you're joining us there as well. We've got a lot of folks on fall break, so I'm glad to see those of you who are still in town. So I thought I would like to begin today just by, how many of you have heard that story before? Okay, so a lot of us have heard the story. I just want to start, and I want to hear some of your reactions. We're not going to pass a microphone or anything. I know that takes up a lot of time. So I just want to, is there any reaction? What did you think? What did you, what is your response to that story? And I want to give you permission, as if you need it, but to say, a lot of times we're told that we need to defend the Bible, and I don't want you in Bible defense mode. I want you in human being mode, that when you hear a story like that, what does it do to you? What questions does it raise? What problems did you have with it? And you can just throw up your hand and shout it out. Okay, so as a parent, that story is excruciating, isn't it? Yeah, Moksha. Right. So think about, as a human being, think about the psychological trauma of you to go through all this, and the bit where they're walking up the mountain where they're going to do this, and Isaac's like, Abraham first of all makes him carry the wood, which is a total jerk move. Isaac's got the wood, and he's like, I see the wood and the fire, but where's the offer? Like, don't you just, doesn't that just like, make you want to throw up a little bit? Like, that's really, really, really bad. And the psychological damage to a human being that goes through all of this and is about to slaughter their own child, and God goes, nah, I'm playing. Really? Like, that seems really, 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 really bad. David.
I think it references to Christ as God gave his only son. He made Christ carry the altar of the cross up to Golgotha.
Yeah.
This is Abraham is making Isaac carry the wood.
So very early on in the Christian tradition, this story became seen through the lens of Jesus in that way. Very early in the Christian story. Yep.
Isaac is old enough. There's no reference that he's got to have been screaming bloody murder.
So
Tied to the wood to be burned up.
right. So what's interesting is, based on some of the things they say later in Genesis about Isaac and how old he was when his mom passed, some people think he was as old as 30-something. Josephus, the first century historian, says he was 25. Either way, when I was 25, if my dad tried to kill me on an altar, I'd have just said, nah, I'm not participating. You have to catch me first. And one of the things I read this week about the story that was really interesting is if you go back through the story, and I gave you, how many of you got the printout when you came in? We're going to use that in a bit. So if you go back through the story, there is absolutely zero emotional language in the story. There is no reference to how anybody feels. It's just mechanical. This deity tells Abraham to go and offer his son. Abraham goes. And there's just zero emotion in the story, which is really, really interesting. That it's just sort of this, Isaac, I would think, would be like, nope, I'm going to tag out on that one, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Elizabeth.
What I see is the fact that he
Okay. Yeah, and I think there is something profound. I bet most people in this room have had a moment in your life. I'm not saying you heard an audible voice, because if you confess to that out loud, then people look at you funny, right? But perhaps have had an internal sort of sense of calling, or like there's this thing you should be doing with your life, or something like that. I think a lot of people probably have experienced that, and then the trust to go through with it. That's Gary. Right? Yeah, like how do you, what is the process to go through to realize I mean, I'll just tell you this. If anybody said to me, okay, you got to sacrifice one of your children, I would have just said, no, I don't. And I won't, because that's insane. Right? And you notice Abraham's response. He doesn't go through discernment. He doesn't gather around close friends and say, I sense God calling me. He's just like, Abraham, go kill your son on a mountain. Okay. That's really, really crazy.
And he's got to be thinking, what about that big promise you made me, the covenant that we have where you're going to make of me a great nation, and
Yep.
my descendants are going to outnumber the stars and the grains of sand.
Right?
Taking my son.
Yeah, we looked at the story of Abraham's call last week, and he's 75, and they don't have any baby. And God's big plan to sort of right creation is for a couple who are pushing 80 to have a baby, and now they've had the baby, and God's like, now I'm gonna ask you to sacrifice that baby. That is a phrase that should never be uttered in any human language. Sacrifice, that's just, I mean.
But it's part of the story, not really. For that day and time, human sacrifice was really more the norm than it was
Yep.
the exception.
Yep, and I want to talk about that some.
To differentiate why this is different. We are different.
Yep.
Our God is different. We ain't playing that game.
You ruined the whole sermon. Thanks.
Okay, see y'all next week.
Lunch, go. I'm sorry, brunch. It's not even that late yet. Yes, there is a sort of, if you notice, Abraham doesn't balk at it. He just is sort of like, all right, where's my slaughtering knife? He just goes. Yeah, does somebody? Sure. Oh.
We actually saw places, they took us on a bus place where they used to do the human sacrifices, and they didn't, it was just, we were like,
Right?
and they were thinking it was just a normal thing in that time.
Yep. Sure.
I can't remember where the verse is, but there's a place in the Old Testament where God is talking about heathen people making their children pass through the fire. If you're sacrificing children, that thought has never entered my mind, he said.
Yeah.
God says that.
Yeah.
A place where it says,
In the Torah, where this story takes place, there's a later passage where God says, who told you to sacrifice your children? I would never tell you to do this. Never crossed my mind. How many of you have ever heard of hell? Okay, so the word hell in the New Testament is the word Gehenna, which in Hebrew means the Valley of Hinnom, which is a place, an actual geographic location that in Jesus' day was a town dump, so there was fire always going, right, burning up the trash. But before Jesus' day, the reason it took on this reputation as being a place of waste and trash is because several Jewish kings offered their children there in fire to the god Molech, their firstborn. While they were told, I would never have you do this, and yet they sort of are going after Molech's blessing. And so some of the Jewish kings, I think Manasseh was one, but I can't be sure. But some of the kings, and so Gehenna took on this bigger sort of if you keep living this way, you might as well just go camp at Gehenna, because that's what you're doing. So child sacrifice was so negatively thought about, so vehemently opposed in Judaism, that by the time of Jesus' day, when they wanted to talk about sort of the ultimate cosmic sort of waste of a human life, they did it. They put it and located it in a place where they practiced child sacrifice. Yep. Anybody else, Karen?
what is it keeps stressing? I'm not messing up the sermon.
We'll see. I'll chastise you if you do.
All right. Just don't burn me.
No.
Entirely burned offering.
So that's a way of this translation. I think the word in Hebrew is where we get our English word Holocaust. And what it means is this type of offering is something that you would, usually when you offered a sacrifice, you would keep a portion of it and eat it as a meal in the presence of the deity. But there were certain offerings where you would just burn the whole thing, because a sacrifice is a meal. And so you would usually eat part of it in the presence of God, but then the part you didn't eat it's like the gods were eating it. Does that make sense? So you're burning it up, but the gods are eating it, and you're eating your part. And this one, you just give it all to God. It's entirely burned up. So I want to dig in, and to get to what I think is going on in this story, I want to take you back into Abraham's story. And this is only going to take 3 or 4 hours of your time. But I think it's really important to sort of see the arc of the story. The story we're talking about today that we're leading up to is known in Hebrew as the Akedah. Let me hear you say Akedah. It means just the binding. In Hebrew, it's assumed you don't even need to say who's being bound. It's Isaac, right? He's being bound on the altar for sacrifice. But in order, I think, to get to this story, we have to go back. We looked last week at Genesis 12 where God says, Abraham, I'm going to instrumentally bless you. I'm going to bless you to be a blessing to the world. You're going to be the father of many, many nations. This is the promise. In Genesis 15, it's reiterated. Then the Lord brought Abram outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars if you think you can count them. He continued, this is how many children you will have. Abraham's like, what about when they all go to college? That's going to be expensive. Like, that's a lot of kids. Genesis 17, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. How many of you are having Amy Grant flashbacks right now when you hear El Shaddai? I was at a festival this summer, and she headlined the festival. It was a festival called Wild Goose. And of course, when you headline a festival, you got to break out your hits. And of course, El Shaddai is on the list. I'm El Shaddai. Walk with me and be trustworthy. I will make a covenant between us, and I will give you many, many descendants. Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, but me, my covenant is with you. You will be the ancestor of many nations. And because I have made you the ancestor of many nations, your name will no longer be Abram, but Abraham. I will make you very fertile. I will produce nations from you, and kings will come from you. Now, a couple things about these names, and this is just for in case you're ever at a place and people are like Bible trivia and you want to win. Here's a couple things you need to know. El Shaddai, the name El Shaddai, it appears 48 times in the Bible, but only 7 times is El Shaddai. So it'll use Shaddai places, but El Shaddai only occurs 7 times, 5 times in Genesis, once in Exodus, and once in Ezekiel. What does El Shaddai mean? This is a big debate among people who are experts in the Bible and experts in Hebrew. They wrestle with what it means because the word could have multiple different sources of origin in the language, and they've tried to sort it out. Some people have suggested it means God the Destroyer, which needs its own theme music, right? Like, dun, 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 God the Destroyer. Some think it means God of the mountain. Some think it means God Almighty. That's usually how it's translated in Bibles, but most scholars now say that's not actually anywhere close to being the best option. This next one is going to be fun. Some people say it means God of many breasts, because the Hebrew word for breast is shad, and shaddai is sort of a plural. And that sounds weird, doesn't it? But in the ancient world, you would often see statues of gods, like Artemis of the Ephesians. You would see statues of Artemis, and she would just have multiple breasts. And the point was that they talked about her as being a source of nourishment, right? And so to say God of many breasts is a way of saying God is our source and the one who nourishes us and makes sure that we're taken care of, right? So it's a mother image for God. Then some say it's just God who is enough. God appears to Abraham. And I think it's somewhere around those two is what we're being invited to see, that this is the God who's enough, the God who is our source, and the God who gives us nourishment, that God is enough. And then Abram, he was known as Exalted Father, and he lived with that name for 99 years. And then his name is changed to Father of a Multitude by God. So, if we keep going from there, one more passage, and then we'll try to jump in. In Genesis 18, the Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre, while he sat at the entrance of his tent in the day's heat. He looked up and suddenly saw 3 men standing near him. Now, here's what you need to know. In the Hebrew Bible, they didn't yet have the understanding of angels at all at this point. When it says messenger of the Lord, or when it says 3 men, they were so insistent on protecting the sanctity of God's name that they would never just refer to God. They would either refer to the Lord's messenger when they're really talking about the Lord. So at the burning bush, the Lord's messenger comes, but he's talking to God, right? And then the other bit of it is that if they ever depicted God, they would often do it in this. They depict God as 3 men. So this is you're to only understand this as being God visiting Abraham. He looked up and suddenly saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from his tent entrance to greet them and bowed deeply. He said, "Sirs, if you would be so kind, don't just pass by your servant. Get a little water. Let